I have the honor to introduce you all to Dr. Chris Field, a professor at the Stanford Dover School of Sustainability. He is also the founding director of the Carnegie Institute's Department of Global Ecology, and his influential and frequently cited work over the years have been mainly focused on climate change and its impacts, big and small. Welcome, Dr. Field. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
So for the first question of today, I was just wondering, could you tell us a little bit about your journey? Essentially, how did you become who you are today?
Sure. When I was very young, I grew up loving hiking and climbing and camping, and was really focused on the outdoors. So I studied ecology in school. And my journey from ecology was basically a journey up the steps of moving to larger and larger spatial scales. I started studying how leaves on individual plants work and integrate with each other. Then I moved to understanding how the different plants in a rainforest share resources. And from there, I started trying to understand how much plant growth takes place at the global level. And it was really at that point that I started appreciating the magnitude of the global changes that humans are causing, and shifted my research, this was more than 30 years ago now, to trying to understand the impacts of human alteration of the environment on the way ecosystems work. And after many years of studying that, I decided that I should really try and understand what we could do about the impacts we were seeing, how nature could help, how nature could be a problem, and what kinds of changes to society, changes to the way we do forestry and agriculture, and changes to big picture things like the way the world economy works could help us tackle the climate problem. I've had a chance to work with many wonderful colleagues over the years and with many wonderful students, and have really both enjoyed and taken a lot of pride in being able to work on one of the most important, probably the most important problem of the century.
Yes, of course. And actually, that's an interesting way to look at the environment. Why do you think it is the most important problem we should tackle in today's world?
Well, partly because lack of attention to it will put us in a situation where basically every other problem gets harder and harder. Potentially every other problem reaches a point where it can't be solved. That's problems of migration, problems of economic growth, problems of ensuring that every person has a fair chance to a sustainable lifestyle. All of those at their root depend on a sustainable climate, a climate that's relatively close to the climate that human societies evolved in. And we now are seeing big impacts of climate change, impacts that are already eroding the potential of people to realize their ambitions. And as that potential decreases, risks of international conflict, lack of opportunity, and just a distortion of the human potential gets to be more and more important. My sense is that we have to solve climate if we want to solve any of the other problems that are really fundamental to the future of the human condition.
Right. So essentially what you're saying is an economist might view inflation as the biggest problem we should tackle, and politicians might view international relations as the biggest problem we should tackle. But really, all of those depend on the fact that the environment, we are living a sustainable life, that we are able to have a better future. Is that right?
That's a good way of putting it. The way I think about it is, it's not that it makes sense to tackle climate in isolation, but we have to tackle climate at the same time we tackle other things. We're not going to solve the other problems unless we solve climate. But it's also important to recognize that solving climate opens some very important new opportunities. As a result of tackling climate, we know we can create jobs around the world, good paying, high skill jobs that really lead to a sustainable future for people and communities around the world. We know that we can help keep communities in place so that people don't have to move away from coastal regions or areas where the wildfire risk gets out of control. And we know that the elements that are necessary to solve the climate problem are also the elements that can contribute to a sustainable economy, whether that's in agriculture or manufacturing or construction. That, as I said before, every issue that's important to people around the world has a connection to the climate crisis. And the climate crisis, if we don't solve it, has the potential to make those problems much worse. if we do attack the climate crisis, it has the potential to make those problems much more susceptible to being fundamentally solved.
Right. And I think that really highlights the importance of why we should all become environmentalists in some sense. All right, the next question I have for you is, what has your experience been like being part of the Stanford Woods Institution, a group at the forefront of environmental research?
Well, for me, it's a source of great pride and satisfaction to know that I'm in a community that's really dedicated to solving big environmental problems. And it's been very satisfying to be able to have confidence that my voice is being heard about the way we should approach these and the kinds of investments that are most likely to pay off in real benefits for people and for ecosystems. I also am the kind of person who fundamentally enjoys working with colleagues on difficult but rewarding challenges. And I have found my time at Stanford to be very rewarding in the sense that I know I'm working with people of very high integrity. I know that the kinds of results that we're achieving have the potential to be deeply helpful for the world. And I know that this is really a shared aspiration across our community.
That is wonderful to hear. The next question I have for you is, I know you were part of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. So I was wondering what your experience as a co-director for one of the groups was like.
IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, really amazing organization, was founded over 30 years ago in 1988. And basically, the world's governments agreed that if the IPCC followed its rules, they would regard its reports as the definitive statement of what we know and what we don't know about climate change. And that creates an awesome responsibility for the IPCC to get the story right. And I certainly took that responsibility seriously, as did all of my other colleagues who worked as authors. But it also was very humbling to understand that the results from the IPCC assessments, based on all of the published scientific literature, really were the foundation for all of the international climate policy that we've seen, including the 2015 Paris Agreement. So I viewed overall the opportunity to work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as an honor and a privilege, but also a very important responsibility to make sure that the scientific community was delivering and continues to deliver to the international community the best information available on where we are in our understanding of climate change.
Right, and I believe the IPCC is also connected with the United Nations, UNEP. I'm just curious, how far do you think we are as the world, as scientist community? How far are we from reaching a consensus of what climate change is, the clear risks? And how do you think we can get to that point where everyone knows exactly what the issue is and how to deal with it?
Well, this question of public understanding of the climate crisis and what we can do about it has a bunch of dimensions. And I think the face of climate change, really importantly, is different for people in communities around the world. And even for folks who have European or American style educations and read the reports about changing temperatures, the way that we all experience climate change is in the events that occur locally, whether it's heat waves or heavy precipitation, or whether it's coastal flooding or wildfire smoke. And I think this appreciation of the local nature of climate impacts is really important. I feel that almost everywhere, no matter where you live and how old you are, that people have seen impacts of a changing climate, and they appreciate that that's not the way that the climate has usually worked. But I think the element that hasn't really been nailed down in many people's thinking is that we are on a pathway to these impacts getting to be more and more serious unless we really accelerate our efforts to tackle climate change. And I think it's all too easy for people to say, well, the heat wave we had last week was a one-off, or it's cooler this week, and to not focus on the fact that we really do need to make some long-term commitments. It's not that the climate impacts we're seeing now are some kind of a new normal. they're a small step on a pathway to much greater impacts unless we really make changes. But I think people also don't realize how much progress we've made in tackling climate. And a way to put that into focus is that when I worked with the IPCC from basically 2008 to about 2015, we were on a trajectory to end the 21st century with warming that was something like 4 Celsius above pre-industrial. And now, as a consequence of changes in technology and changes in policy, we're doing better, not a lot better, but the end of century warming in a business as usual framing is probably on the order of 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius, which is a long part of where we need to get to stabilize at 2 degrees Celsius or less. And so there has been impressive progress, and we need to build on that progress, but we also need to go much more rapidly with emissions cuts if we're going to have a hope of being anywhere close to that 2 Celsius or well below 2 Celsius target as the Paris Agreement argues for.
And on the subject of public knowledge and public information, I recently listened to your podcast with Sam Harris, the philosopher and author, and I believe you briefly touched upon there is a growing number of non-believers of climate change on the internet. So we all know that information is becoming more and more accessible, which unfortunately means that misinformation has also become more accessible. So how do you think the scientific information should be disseminated in the public, especially those related to climate change?
Well, I don't think that the community of climate skeptics or climate deniers is getting bigger. I think that over the last 30 years, the number of climate skeptics has actually decreased dramatically. And the evidence of global warming is now so pervasive that you really have to be almost purposely ignoring the evidence in order to be a climate denier. And even people who belong to political parties, it's been a part of the Republican paradigm in the United States where the party is opposed to action on climate. And my impression is that many of the individuals, including elected officials in the Republican Party, understand that the climate's changing and that there are serious implications of not doing enough. But I think the secret to spreading the word on climate really has 2 big components. One big component is that the messengers need to be diverse, and a few of them can be scientists like me, but many need to be other people in the public spotlight, athletes, actors, politicians, or people who aren't in the public spotlight, family members, friends, teachers. And that base for communication needs to be much broader than it is. The second thing I think is important is that we need to reframe climate action as being about building a better world, a world where we have abundant access to renewable energy, where we have opportunities for good livelihoods for people around the world, and to not fall into a framing that climate change action is about giving something up, about losing rights or losing flexibility. And there's essentially no evidence for the argument that climate change action is about giving things up. It just means we'll need to do things differently. And that part of the story hasn't been as effectively communicated as it needs to be.
I see. Despite all of the dangers you were talking about and continuing along this path, I watched this video about you on Stanford's YouTube channel, and you stated that you were an optimist. So I'm wondering, do you still feel optimistic about the future even now? And if so, why? What makes you an optimist?
Well, I am an optimist. I'm an optimist that eventually we will solve this challenge. I'm not optimistic that we will meet the 1.5 Celsius target or the goal of the Paris Agreement of stabilizing warming at well below 2°C above pre-industrial. But I'm optimistic that we'll solve it eventually. And I see wonderful technology coming together. I see a broader and broader appreciation of the importance of the problem. I see an increasing appreciation of the understanding that we need to solve climate if we're going to solve any of our other problems. And I see young people like you being more and more interested in being involved in the area. All those are strong reasons for optimism. The big challenge I see is that with the current level of interest and commitment and finance and policy, things are just moving much too slowly. And with the current pace of change, I think we are still headed for truly unacceptable impacts and truly unacceptable levels of damage from warming. And we need to continue to be outspoken about accelerating progress.
Mm-hmm. Actually, talking about getting young people involved, I know that many of my peers, so Gen Z, we are growing up with the knowledge that, you know, the Earth is not near destruction, but reaching that path of destruction already. So we're kind of already aware of the issue, but a lot of us, we don't really know how to get involved. So I'm just curious, do you have any ideas how the youth and Gen Z, we can like add our voices to this fight against climate change?
Well, I think that young people have actually been very effective in increasing attention and increasing focus on the importance of the climate problem over a long period of time, especially over the last several years. And youth groups like the Sunshine Movement or youth leaders like Greta Thunberg really have done an excellent, outstanding, amazing job of helping focus attention on the responsibility that people in my generation have to deliver solutions. And I think that's been very effective. Simply being outspoken, willing to take a stand, and willing to be visible in the area of action on climate. But young people, like the people in my generation, should also be doing more. They should be voting their interests, making sure that their representatives in government are advancing the agenda on climate action. They should be working for solutions, whether that's starting companies that build new products or deploy renewable systems at a much more rapid rate. And they should be working in areas of climate finance to make sure that we have the resources necessary for not only building the technology to build a zero emissions energy system, but to help people around the world adapt. They should be active in non-governmental organizations to help advance the agenda and help protect especially people in the most vulnerable regions. And they should really be activists on all these fronts. And I think the evidence I see is that people in your generation really are committed to the agenda and really are making a difference, that your commitment has moved the needle already and will continue to be really important as all of us work together to accelerate action.
That's really, I'm happy to hear that. And I hope that this inspiration can live on, not just with our generation, but, you know, when we get older, that we'll continue to have this inspiration to fight for the climate. I just wanted to end on a more lighthearted question. So we've been talking a bit about climate change, but I did hear about the fact that the Dover School of Sustainability will have a special guest today in the Dean's Lecture. It's the President of Indonesia. Is that correct?
He is visiting today. Yes, we're very excited about that.
What are your thoughts about that? I thought it was just very interesting.
Well, the ambition of the Stanford Dover School of Sustainability really is to be a meaningful element in global conversations about what we do about sustainability, and where we have the opportunity to interact with political leaders or with major environmental organizations, with youth groups, with companies. We should be taking advantage of those to help nail down the recognition that we all need to work together to solve these problems, that no matter how good the scholarship is from my university or from a university in Europe or in the Middle East, we don't solve this problem unless we all work together. And I think the visit from the president of Indonesia is a really nice example of a willingness to have a different kind of conversation than we've had before, a really important example.
That's great to hear. And let's wrap it up with just one last question. If you had to give one piece of advice to a high school student, what would it be?
Well, I think high school students should continue to pursue the ideas that they're passionate about. And I know that many are passionate about tackling the climate crisis. And I hope that the fire of that passion continues to burn brightly, and that the world is in a position to take advantage of the commitment and integrity that everyone who's in high school now has potential to bring to this critically important issue.
That's great to hear. And that brings us to the end of the interview. Again, thank you, Dr. Field, for participating. It was great to have such a fruitful discussion with you today. I really enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Going to end the video now.